4 men sit in different rooms in different decades. They have never met. They did not coordinate. And yet they are all writing about the same man, Jesus, and telling stories that overlap so much that you could arrange them in parallel columns and see the pattern almost perfectly. Matthew tells a story. Mark tells it. Luke tells it again, sometimes with different details, but the same basic shape. And then John. John tells a story that makes you stop and ask, did we just read the same man's life? You sit in a library or a church basement, or at your kitchen table, and you read the Gospels in order, Matthew through John, and something shifts in your mind around chapter 1 of John. The first 3 Gospels open with genealogies or births or baptism scenes. Concrete. Earthly. But John opens with philosophy. In the beginning was the Word. The Greek-educated listener hears logos, not just a word, but reason, divine principle, the organizing mind of the cosmos. Jesus is not introduced as Mary's son. He is introduced as the light that came to illumine the world. Here's what most people miss. The 4 Gospels are not 4 attempts to write the same biography. They are 4 distinct theological portraits painted by 4 different artists who saw Jesus through 4 different lenses. And nowhere is that truth more obvious than when you place John alongside Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is not a story about discrepancies. This is not a story about contradiction. This is a story about intentional theological choice. And it begins with one question: why did John, whoever John was, decide that the other 3 had not said everything that needed saying? To understand why John is different, you have to understand who John is writing for. Matthew writes for Jewish believers who need Jesus to be the Messiah, the one promised in the Hebrew Scriptures. He quotes the prophets constantly. Every miracle proves the pattern. Mark writes for Roman readers, quick-paced, action-driven, asking, "Who is this man?" Luke writes for Greek philosophical readers and emphasizes Jesus' universality, his compassion for the excluded. John writes for something else. John writes for people who have already heard the other 3 accounts. He writes for a community that is beginning to grapple with a dangerous question: if Jesus was human, how could he be God? If he was God, how could he be human? This is not a question Matthew, Mark, or Luke directly address. John makes it the centerpiece of his entire gospel. Watch what happens in the opening of John. He does not begin with Mary and Joseph. He does not begin with John the Baptist pointing at Jesus and saying, "Behold, the Lamb of God." He begins with cosmic theology. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. Then, after 17 verses of theological precision, he adds almost as an afterthought, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." The Greek word is logos. It means word, yes, but it also means reason, principle, divine intelligence. To a Greek ear, and John was writing to Greek ears, this word carried philosophical weight. But watch the move John makes. He takes a philosophical concept, and he makes it incarnate. He makes it flesh. This is the boldest Christological claim in all 4 Gospels. Here's the part nobody tells you: the other 3 Gospels never make this claim explicit. Matthew never says, "Jesus is God and cosmic principle." Mark never explores it. Luke never develops it. But John plants his flag on this ground and will not move. And this difference cascades through everything. Because if Jesus is the pre-existent logos, if he is the cosmic organizing principle, then his words carry a different weight. They become not just teachings but revelations. Not just truths but cosmic truths. Which brings you to the "I am" sayings. Matthew, Mark, and Luke contain very few absolute "I am" claims. But John saturates his gospel with them. "I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the vine." These are not humble claims. These are not metaphors. These are declarations of divine identity. The Greek phrase is ego eimi, literally, "I am," and it echoes the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush. When God tells Moses who he is, God says in Hebrew, I am that I am. Ani hu ani. In John's Gospel, Jesus speaks in that same register. I am. Stay with me. This is not aggressive or presumptuous. This is the most intimate theology in the New Testament. Because Jesus is not shouting these claims from a pulpit. He is speaking them in conversations. To a woman at a well. To disciples at dinner. To a man born blind. To a grieving sister. The I am sayings are spoken in the context of human need. I am the bread of life, and you are hungry. I am the light, and you are in darkness. I am the resurrection, and someone you love is dead. Now, if you were John, and you wanted to communicate this truth, that Jesus is the divine Logos made flesh, how would you structure a gospel? Matthew uses parables. Mark uses brief, punchy stories. Luke uses narrative flow. But John uses signs. 7 of them. And after each sign, Jesus explains what the sign means. It is a teaching method designed for theology, not just narrative. The first sign, water turned to wine at a wedding. A small miracle, almost intimate. But Jesus says to the servants, You have kept the good wine until now. The sign points to abundance, to transformation, to the fullness that Jesus brings. And John's readers, steeped in theology, would have understood, this is the Logos revealing the nature of the kingdom. The second sign, an official's son healed from a distance. The third, a lame man at the pool of Bethesda made whole. But watch, John does not narrate the crowd's amazement. He narrates the meaning. After the pool of Bethesda healing, Jesus says, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing. He is explaining the metaphysical relationship between himself and God. This is theology embedded in narrative. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the same healing stories. But they do not stop to explain the cosmic implications. John does. Every story is a doorway to understanding. But here is what gets lost when you read John in isolation. The other 3 Gospels have already introduced you to the 12 apostles, and they have already established Peter as the leader. Peter is the rock. Peter is the one who confesses the Messiah. Peter is the one to whom Jesus gives the keys of the kingdom. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all give Peter prominence. John systematically repositions authority. Not away from Peter, John is not being contradictory, but toward someone else. Toward the beloved disciple. This figure appears in John and nowhere else in the Gospels. The beloved disciple is the one who reclines on Jesus' breast at dinner. The beloved disciple is the one who understands Jesus most deeply. The beloved disciple is the one who stands at the cross when all others have fled. The beloved disciple is the first witness to the empty tomb. And John, this is the crafty part, John never names himself. But the Church has understood since the 2nd century that John the Apostle is the beloved disciple. Irenaeus, writing in 180 AD, states it plainly, John, the disciple of the Lord, published this gospel. He is speaking of himself in the 3rd person. He is placing himself, not Peter, but himself, at the center of Jesus' emotional world. I was the one he loved most. I was the one who understood. I was the one who received the intimacy that matters. This is not prideful. It is profound. Because if you are going to write a theology of incarnation, if you are going to claim that the cosmic Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, you need to speak from the place of deepest intimacy. And John is saying, I stood at that intersection. I was held by the God who became human. Therefore I can tell you what this means. There are 5 people who appear in John and nowhere else, or appear in ways so distinct that John's version is almost unrecognizable. And each one tells you something about why John is writing the gospel he is writing. Nicodemus comes first. He appears 3 times in John, and only in John. A Pharisee, a ruler of the Jews, he comes to Jesus at night. Jesus tells him, You must be born again. The Greek phrase is geneo analen, born from above, born anew, born of the Spirit. Nicodemus misunderstands and asks, How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb? It is a moment of profound misunderstanding, and John uses it to illustrate the gap between earthly thinking and heavenly thinking. Nicodemus represents the honest seeker who cannot yet grasp what incarnational theology means. But watch, Nicodemus appears again. He defends Jesus before the Sanhedrin. And then, after the crucifixion, Nicodemus comes with Joseph of Arimathea to prepare Jesus' body. His arc is complete. He moves from confusion to faith. Thomas comes next. Thomas is famous for his doubt, but that is only in John. In the Synoptics, Thomas is barely mentioned. But John loves Thomas. When Jesus says, "Let us go to Bethany to Lazarus," the other disciples say, "Master, the Jews will stone you." But Thomas says, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." This is not doubt. This is loyalty unto death. And later, when Jesus appears to the disciples after the resurrection, Thomas is absent. When he returns and hears the testimony, he says, "Unless I see the mark of the nails and put my hand in his side, I will not believe." Thomas the doubter. But then, watch what happens. Jesus appears. Jesus says, "Put your hand here, into my side." And Thomas cries out, "My Lord and my God." The highest Christological confession in all four Gospels. Not, "You are the Messiah." Not, "You are God's Son." But "You are God." Only in John. Mary of Bethany and her sister Martha appear in the Synoptics, but John's treatment of them is distinct. The story of Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, appears only in John. And it is the climactic sign. It is the seventh and greatest miracle. Lazarus has been dead 4 days. His body stinks. And Jesus calls him out. The Greek word is phoneo, to call out, to summon. But John makes it clear that Jesus could have called any dead person. He chose Lazarus because he loved him. This is the Logos operating not through cosmic power but through love. Through the most human of emotions. Mary Magdalene appears in all four Gospels at the resurrection. But in the Synoptics, she is one of several women who discover the empty tomb and are told by an angel that Jesus has risen. She is a witness to the resurrection. But in John, something extraordinary happens. Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb alone. She finds the stone rolled away. She runs to Peter and the beloved disciple and says, "They have taken the Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Then she stands outside the tomb, weeping. And she sees 2 angels. And then she sees Jesus. But she does not recognize him. She mistakes him for the gardener. And then Jesus speaks her name. Mary. 1 word. And she recognizes him. And she falls at his feet. And Jesus says, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." John gives Mary Magdalene the task that Peter receives in Matthew. She is the apostle to the apostles. She is the first preacher of the resurrection. This is John's vision of authority. Not based on institutional position, but on intimacy with the risen Christ. You were closest to him. You saw him first. You speak. And then there is Judas. All 4 Gospels tell of his betrayal. But only John captures the moment of unmasking. Jesus is at dinner with his disciples. He says, "One of you will betray me." The disciples are distressed. Peter asks the beloved disciple to ask Jesus who it is. And Jesus says, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then he dips the bread and gives it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. And then Satan entered into him. And Jesus says, "What you are going to do, do quickly." This is devastation compressed into a single moment. Jesus knows. Jesus feeds him. Jesus names him. Not with anger but with sorrow. The Logos, the organizing principle of the universe, leans across a table and hands bread to the man who will betray him. This is John's vision of incarnational love. Not triumphalism. Not cosmic power. But a man, God become flesh, offering bread to his enemy. You are coming now to the heart of John's Gospel. We are in the upper room. Jesus and the 12 are at dinner. It is the Last Supper. And here is where John breaks most dramatically from the other accounts. Matthew and Mark narrate the institution of communion. Jesus takes bread, breaks it, and says, "This is my body." He takes a cup and says, "This is my blood of the covenant, shed for many." It is the central ritual act of Christian worship. Luke records it too. But John does not record the institution of communion at all. Instead, John records the foot washing. Jesus rises from the meal. He takes off his outer garment. He wraps a towel around his waist. He pours water into a basin. And he begins to wash his disciples' feet. This was the work of a slave, a servant, the lowest position in the social order. And the God become flesh, the one who is worshipped in heaven, the Logos through whom all things were made, is washing the feet of fishermen and tax collectors. Peter is horrified. Peter says, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus says, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." And Peter says, "Then wash not only my feet but also my hands and my head." And Jesus says, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean." This is mysterious language. But the meaning becomes clear when Jesus finishes. He says, "Do you know what I have done? You call me teacher and Lord. And that is true. But if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you." The Synoptics contain this teaching in other forms. Matthew records Jesus saying, "Whoever would be greatest among you must be your servant." Mark records, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." But John does not say it. John enacts it. He does not tell you that love is self-emptying. He shows you the Logos emptying himself, kneeling, pouring water, touching tired feet. This is John's method. This is why his gospel is different. He teaches through incarnational theater. And then comes the discourse. John 14-17. 4 chapters of Jesus speaking. Some of this material appears in the Synoptics, but not like this. Not with such intensity. Not with such theological precision. Jesus speaks to his disciples about his going away and his sending of the Holy Spirit. He speaks about the vine and the branches. He speaks about the world's hatred. He speaks about his glory. And he prays. The prayer in John 17 is called the high priestly prayer. Jesus prays not just for the disciples but for all who will believe through their word. The prayer is so intimate, so theologically dense, that you feel you are reading something sacred. Something not meant to be heard by outsiders. The Synoptics do not contain anything like this. This is John's unique contribution. This is what John means when he says implicitly that the other three had not said everything that needed saying. I have stood at the heart of Jesus' prayer. I have heard him speak in ways the crowds never heard. I know things the other Gospels did not record. You now see why the 4 Gospels are not 4 attempts to write the same thing. They are 4 distinct visions, and John's vision is the most theologically mature. Matthew writes the Gospel of the Kingdom. Mark writes the Gospel of the Messiah in hiding. Luke writes the Gospel of Compassion. John writes the Gospel of Incarnation. The Word became flesh. The cosmic Logos emptied itself into human form. And the implications of this claim shape everything else he writes. When you read John with fresh eyes, when you understand that he is intentionally different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, something shifts. You stop expecting him to match them. You stop looking for contradiction. Instead, you see a man who has spent decades, perhaps 50 years or more, meditating on the life of Jesus. You see a man who has outlived the other apostles. You see a man writing from the vantage point of advanced age, from the perspective of exile on the island of Patmos, and from the depths of intimate memory. The other Gospels were written earlier. Mark in the 50s or 60s. Matthew and Luke in the 70s or 80s. But John is written late. Perhaps in the 90s, perhaps early 2nd century. By this time, the Church has spread across the Mediterranean. The first generation of apostles is dying. And the pressing question is no longer, is Jesus the Messiah? That is settled. The pressing question is, who is Jesus? What is the nature of his divinity? How do we worship a human being who is also God? John's answer echoes through centuries. He points you back to the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. The one who became flesh dwelt among you. You have seen his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. This is the message that Matthew, Mark, and Luke make possible. But John is the voice that dares to name it directly. John is the one who has the spiritual authority, the intimacy with Jesus, to speak the unspeakable. The divine Logos is human. The human Jesus is God. And when you understand this, all four Gospels become not a problem to solve but a gift to receive. Matthew gives you the promise keeper. Mark gives you the powerful one. Luke gives you the compassionate one. And John gives you the Word made flesh. The one in whom all things hold together. The light that came to illumine the world. You are not reading four accounts of the same biography. You are reading four theologies. Four angles of approach to a mystery so vast that no single human perspective can contain it. Four voices, saying together, over and over, this is who Jesus is. And each voice adds something the others do not. Matthew gives you the law fulfilled. Mark gives you the secret. Luke gives you the scandal of God's love for the poor and lost. And John gives you the metaphysics. The thought of God thinking. The word that was spoken before time. 3 takeaways remain as you close this gospel and return to your life. First, gospel diversity is not a problem. It is a feature. The four gospels disagree because they are trying to communicate something too vast for any single account. The disagreements are not corruptions. They are evidence that the church was humble enough to preserve four voices instead of flattening them into one. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not all agree. But together, they testify to something true. Second, John is writing for a specific moment and a specific audience. He is not trying to replace the others. He is assuming you know them. He is adding layers. He is saying, now that you have heard about the Messiah, let me tell you about the Word. This is why scholars have always said that John came last. Not because John did not know the traditions that the synoptics preserve, but because John is intentionally extending those traditions into new theological territory. Third, understanding John changes how you read all four. It teaches you to read the Gospels not as an encyclopedia that should contain all information about Jesus, but as four distinct theological witnesses. Each one is true. Each one is incomplete without the others. Matthew is the Jewish Gospel. Mark is the dramatic Gospel. Luke is the humanitarian Gospel. John is the mystical Gospel. Together, they form a testimony so multifaceted, so human, so divine, that they have convinced millions that they are reading not human speculation but the record of God's act in history. The four Gospels are four doorways into the same mystery. John's doorway is the narrowest and the deepest. It leads to places the others do not go. But you cannot reach it unless you have first stood in the doorways of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You need them to understand John. And you need John to understand them. This is why the Gospel of John is nothing like the other three. This is also why all four together are everything.